Good morning and good evening. Thanks for tuning in into this webinar. This is the second webinar of our series on the path to net zero. I am Anant, head of carbon compliance markets. And at Azzera, we assist aviation with creating and executing their path to net zero. We provide measurements of different emission scope for an aviation operator or an airport, followed by target setting and access to environmental markets. We have a technical team that also curates high-quality carbon offset projects for delivering on your goals. So for today's webinar, we've got an extremely interesting panel lined up. Firstly, Nigel Addison-Smith from PA Consulting, who is Director of Finance, Fleet and Traffic Forecasting Lead. I heard Nigel speak about a month ago at a conference, and he had some interesting insights on costs for this transition. I will allow Nigel to introduce himself later, but widely he will explain the costs of alternatives to getting to net zero. Next, we have Enrique Heidelman Cardozo, who is Head of Sustainability at Embraer. Enrique will take us through the practices and goals for Embraer's cleaner future. And lastly, we have Nick Hausman, co-founder of Azzera, but also co-owner of Elite Avia, with a large fleet of aircraft operating in the space of business aviation. Thanks all for joining, and I look forward to a great discussion. The webinar itself will last for about 1 hour, with about 35 minutes for presentation and the rest of the time in the Q&A. If you have any knee-jerk questions, please drop them over in the Q&A box and we'll come to them later. So let's start with a look at global aviation emissions and provide some brief context and a somewhat cliched starting point to any conversation on net zero. The global aviation industry produces around 2% of all man-made CO2 emissions, and business aviation takes up roughly 2% of those air transport emissions. And that's easily close to about 20 million tons. This was pre-COVID. Now we see that the industry is much below the 2019 level, even in 2022. When I first saw this graph, I was wondering if behavioral changes in terms of how we fly post-COVID could ensure that we stay under the 2019 levels, but that alone is in no way enough. We need an evolving industry that sets realistic net zero goals for 2030, but more importantly, achieves them year to year. There is also existing competition within the industry that has already pushed aircrafts to newer efficiencies. The International Energy Agency reports that between 2010 and 2019, fuel efficiency saw a 1.9% year-on-year improvement, while passenger demand also increased 5% each year. So while aviation demand has continued to grow, fuel efficiencies have not been able to keep up. So the industry as a whole must execute on their commitments for alternative fuels, operational improvements, and market-based measures. So for commercial aviation, just this October in Montreal, at the 41st ICAO Assembly, the delegates from over 184 states and 57 organizations adopted a long-term global aspirational goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This was in no way a small feat, but of course delayed since the industry was not included in the 2015 Paris Agreement conversation. The business aviation community, on the other hand, through the International Business Aviation Council and GAMA, declared their goals about 6 years earlier in 2009, and then even updated it in 2016. So this put general aviation ahead in the game, but they also have other advantages that keeps them ahead. Firstly, most environmental innovations are first tried out by business and general aviation before they're scaled up for commercial aviation. And there's also the average lifespan comparison. An average lifespan of a business jet is about 16 years, whereas a commercial jet can stay in operation for about 23 years. So with faster fleet renewals comes evolution of engines, airframes, and avionics, which each contribute to greater efficiencies. So between 2010 and 2020, business aviation improved fuel efficiency by about 2% each year. But across both the segments, commercial and business, we find that there is one pathway that is clearly nominated as the savior, and that's sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. It's expected to be a deciding factor in reaching these goals. From SAF alone, business aviation expects a 40% reduction in CO2 in life cycle emissions in absolute terms. But commercial aviation is even betting greater. With SAF, they expect to serve about 65% of net zero commitments by 2050. And already, most commercial aviation operators are securing large offtake agreements, fuel producers. So how much of residual SAF capacity is expected to be set aside for business aviation? It's not known. And will there be lower availability for SAF among business aviation? So this is a question which I think I'll come back to our panelists in the Q&A. So the aviation footprint, to just see what we're dealing with in terms of entity level emissions. Firstly, there are three cases for emissions from aviation. You have within airports, which is within operations, ground service equipment. Secondly, within flights, where fuel burn is over 70 to 80% of emissions, but also air conditioning on the ground through gensets, APU usage, catering, and also aircraft maintenance. Thirdly, it's the organization itself, where you have employee-related travel, energy costs for building, heating, cooling. So to make this example more real, I've included the emissions footprint of an airport and the categories for accounting. So scope 1 here is primarily fuel combustion from company vehicles. That's the gray column at the center. On the left is scope 2 for indirect emissions from purchased electricity, which can be for heating or cooling needs. And scope 3 is from purchased materials, waste and water, aircraft APU usage, contract owned vehicles, and outsourced activities. So in this example, the case study is around Edinburgh Airport's carbon footprint, which was in 2021 about 61,000 tons. And 95% of that value was from scope 3. Its scope 2 was surprisingly lower, as it primarily purchased renewable energy for its operations. The remainder from mostly scope 1, which was burning of natural gas and usage of refrigerants. This is for an airport, but if you think of an aircraft operator, the largest source of their emissions would be from scope 1, which is fuel used for the flight operations, including the time that the engines are working on the ground. The fuel which is used under ground service equipment, which you can call as tractors and towing gear, is usually included within the scope 1 of an aircraft operator, only if those assets are owned by the operator himself. So coming back to the airport has unavoidable air emissions in areas like refrigerant use, natural gas for heating, which is scope 1, and scope 3, which is mostly organization direct control. So for scope 3, which is indirect control for the organization, you have third-party de-icers, third-party operational vehicles, but also their employees' business travel. So for these unavoidable emissions, they can be easily offsetted with high-quality projects, and it helps for the airport to visualize the cost benefit for transitioning to an alternative. And at the same time, while there are some regions that have access to cleaner electricity grids, multiple suppliers, not all have the luxury of choice. So the report which is submitted for the Edinburgh Airport also estimates the emissions that arise from the climb, the cruise, and the descent of flight traffic arriving at the airport or leaving the airport, but it doesn't account for those emissions within the airport's boundaries. So if you just look at this number alone, it's about 188,000 tons and almost 3 times the airport's entire footprint. But however, the impact of the CO2 emissions is local, which means it's in the airport's best interest to optimize their aircraft management practices for air traffic and reduce them. So the airport, for example, could make available electric taxis or tows to move the aircraft from the runway to the stand. I heard about this idea in Objective Sky Green. They find that electrification of taxi in and taxiing with a tow can save about 1% of the total fuel burn. And that's because the weight of the plane is the main proponent of fuel burn. The taxiing in has 50% low fuel burn than the taxiing out. Another handbook called the ICAO Operational Opportunities to Reduce Fuel Burn and Emissions provides some of the following recommendations for airports. They could improve their low visibility takeoff and landing capabilities to reduce congestions and reduce any delays. And then there's also improved air traffic management to reduce your idling time and holding time. The question around using preconditioned air can be substituted with electric compressors, which would then replace those trailer-mounted units which supply stationary aircraft at the terminal and also during maintenance. And there's a trade-off which is really interesting between noise reduction and increased fuel burn, because sometimes noise reduction measures are implemented at airports, which can result in increased fuel burn and emissions. And these measures, they include extra flying time, extra taxiing time to go to preferred flight tracks or runways, or even enforce landing and takeoff at non-optimal speeds. So let's have a look at the operator-related emissions next. So for operators, efforts in 4 key areas were first introduced in the Business Aviation Commitment on Climate Change in 2009. They were categorized into modern technology, sustainable aviation fuel, operational improvements, and modernized infrastructure, and market-based measures. When the commitments were revised, they formulated the 4 pillars, and each pillar in itself here must be aggressive to reach the new net zero goal. The industry itself will need a substantial shift in aircraft innovation, a transition to sustainable energy sources, including a significant increase of SAF consumption, a modernized and efficient operational infrastructure, and acknowledgement that offsets will most likely be necessary to accelerate the pace to net zero. Our panelists who are here today will have experience in all of these areas, and I look forward to a good discussion when we come to them. So let's look at the first pillar, which is fleet modernization. Objective Sky Green, which is a report released by Eurocontrol, recommends that airlines accelerate the pace of fleet renewals by about 3 to 7 years to ensure that they operate the most efficient and new technology. But at the other hand, this also reduces their reliance on market-based measures. It was interesting to note that according to the report, if emission reductions from fleet upgrades and operational improvements are achieved by 2030, fuel consumption could be reduced by almost 17% in the base case scenario, which is a significant improvement considering that about 1/3 of the European aircraft stock will be renewed. However, let's not forget that those are really huge costs. But I think in general, the report is really interesting. In their forecast, they admit that the scope for innovation within new jets will be limited to evolutionary changes rather than disruptive ones. If we drill down a bit more into those evolutionary changes, I can think of 2 scopes. The first is airframe design, where even a small but a radical innovation can be instrumental. For example, the wingtips on aircraft wings, which led to 2% low fuel burn. And it's worthy to note that designs like these in an industry which is already highly competitive starts first with safety and then next fuel efficiency. Another exciting improvement is shark skin film. It's a film that's applied to the body of the airframe, and the film has a ribbed microstructure that enhances wind flow around the airframe. So just very recently, about a month ago, Swiss Airlines has started application of the innovation on its fleet. And they claim that the technology will help them reduce about 15,000 tons per year for their fleet. The second category is engine evolution. And here, I think it will be most interesting to see how original equipment manufacturers evolve within advanced biofuels like SAF. So while the fuel itself is essentially the same as Jet A, it can have different maintenance impacts on the engine. And I think Enrique here is the best to speak on that later on in the session. To the second pillar, which is infrastructure and operational efficiencies, this section really applies to both airports as well as operators, and particularly relevant to flight patterns. So let's start with the first one, which is airport airspace modernization. So in 2020, the addition of the new ADS-B communication system eliminated the need for remote communication infrastructure, but also improved early detection of aircrafts to optimize their flight paths within an airspace. And this was one radical change that the industry had to adjust to. Of course, it was a huge cost. There are several others within airspace modernization, and there's a guideline for this called the Single European Sky, which provides the necessary policy and regulatory framework. The second is operational improvements, and that has several points under it. I'll be brief through most of them. And so just to generally categorize them, these are measures that reduce fuel consumption, such as measures that attack holding or sequencing times. So improved air traffic management methods, such as more fuel-efficient trajectories and reduced holding time. There's an interesting fact here, which is the weight of the fuel itself adds to extra fuel burn. So for an aircraft to carry extra weight, there's an estimate from ITA which suggests that extra fuel carriage for that extra weight is between about 2.5% to 4.5% of the weight itself. Next, there's a lot of electrification that can be done with ground service equipment like handlers, tows, air conditioning units. But then the ability to action them lies really in the entity that operates those units. In North America and in Europe, responsibility for conversion of ground service equipment rests entirely with the aircraft operator and not with the airport. Next, within avionics improvements, they seem to be necessary to meet regulatory needs, but they're also necessary for the operator himself because it maintains the value of the asset. So the aircraft's residual value will be negatively impacted if it's not equipped to meet regulatory mandates. But also a non-compliance aircraft could mean could face loss of revenues because they simply cannot access certain airspace. Lastly, in terms of maintenance, it's possible that over a period of about 5 years, an aircraft or an airframe can experience a drag of about 2%. And this is a result of airframe imperfections like gaps in seals and frames, or even the accumulation of dirt. And here you have technologies like machine learning that feeds on the airflow patterns and the flight data and can actually predict localized maintenance schedules. So in general, this space has a lot of chance for opportunities for decarbonization. Now to the most anticipated pathway for decarbonization, which is SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel. Needless to say, the challenges around availability are enormous, and so are the costs. The book and claim system aims to solve the problem of regional availability with the introduction of SAF-C credits. And with a SAF-C certificate, an aircraft operator can claim reductions for SAF that is burnt elsewhere. But there are, of course, risks of double counting and the use of disturbing feedstock. At Azzera, we provide the service of tracing your SAF and identifying the feedstock for quality, feedstock quality for any operator. And it's just important to know that using this high quality feedstock will improve, firstly, reduction claims in a program like CORSIA that recognizes it, but then it'll also improve the future availability of that fuel from that pathway. But I agree that the conversation on SAF can be a webinar in itself, so I apologize for reducing the scope for this discussion. I think we'll most likely have a separate session on SAF itself. Now to the fourth pillar, which is market-based measures. And Within that, carbon offsetting is the big one. At Azzera, we provide a curated portfolio of projects with a specific interest to the operator. For example, a project that has direct environmental benefits when it is within the same region as the operator or the airport in that case. And then, you have projects which have specific sustainable development goals which are attached, and usually people look out for those. But as a general overview of the voluntary carbon market, we find that the same challenges exist as with SAF. We must consume high quality credits with good social and environmental co-benefits. For now, there is a vast ocean of projects with weak additionality claims and not very great mechanisms, where often consumers are at risk to greenwashing claims. And I feel that we must move with our best foot forward if we are to avoid a secondary problem in our plan to decarbonize aviation. So at Azzera, we've set up a rating system to help solve this issue. And our rating scoring is a 5-point system resulting from a weighted sum of 4 of the criteria that's here on the presentation. For each project, we spend time understanding the official documentation, reviewing and rating key features of the projects, and querying the project developers. So our final rating is always the result of 2 different assessors. The first is we evaluate the mechanisms by which emissions are either avoided or removed from the atmosphere. We evaluate the assurance that the credits effectively represent a ton of CO2 and not over or underestimate the values. And then investigate measurements to validate that the baselines are effectively estimated. Secondly, we want to ensure that the revenues from the credits that are sold are doing more than business as usual. And this is what we refer to as additionality. And in general, we must fund projects that are truly doing more for climate change mitigation that would not have occurred without funding via carbon credit revenue. So it's not simply a yes or no question, but rather a scale. And we've broken down additionality into 2 types, regulatory and financial additionality. Next, within permanence, we seek the answer to the question, for how long are the emissions staying out of the atmosphere? The ideal project should have an infinite storage or avoidance time, which limits the permanence, but there's no such really ideal project at this point. And then at the end, finally, we define whether or not projects have impact that go beyond climate action. As others, we work with by defining co-benefits in line with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And whenever we've fallen short of essential data, we always go back to the project developer for more information. And in case we find missing information, we rate lower. Overall, we do a periodical review of the criteria, and a final rating is provided whenever we propose a project. And projects that don't meet our standards or are really low on scale are not considered in our portfolio. And this is the team that sits at Zurich. All right, so from here, I'm going to hand over to Henrique, and Henrique, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so well, thank you all for participating in this webinar. I'm Henrique Heidemann. I'm the head of sustainability for Embraer Commercial Aviation. Next slide, please. So maybe we can hit like enter 2 times so the animation finishes and then I can talk. So last year in Embraer, we have committed ourselves to help aviation to get carbon free by 2050, which is almost every organization in airline and big company goal by now. Can you hit enter 2 times? Yes, thank you. And then I have set for us, well, maybe that's too much. Then we have set for ourselves some targets. For scope 1s, which are our direct emissions, we have started using sustainable aviation fuel from this year and from last year and on, actually. And our target is to have a usage of 25% by 2040. Then scope 2, which are our indirect emissions with energy consumption. We want to be 100% sourcing our energy from renewable sources by 2030. In Brazil, by the next 2 years, we think we are going to reach that target, actually. And then for scope 3, which is the most important part of aviation in our case, because if we take an aircraft life cycle, then more than 99% of its emission will come from fuel use and fuel burn, of course. Then for us, scope 3, it's really important. Then for that, we have set ourselves targets to have a 100% portfolio of aircraft being able to run on 100% sustainable aviation fuel by 2030, and also keep pushing new technologies such as hybrid aircraft, electric aircraft, and hydrogen aircraft as well. And this will be the main aspects that I'm going to cover in the next few slides of this presentation. Next. So scope 3 for us, this is our view for the segment up to 150 packs. There are a lot of views very similar to that one. And I will try to point which are the specifics when we're talking about the segment up to 150 packs. So the first, and maybe you can hit enter like 2 or 3 times. One, can you hit enter? One more. One more. Yes, that's good. Thank you. And then, well, technology, which is the blue part, the blue portion of the chart, can contribute to 8 to 10%. And as I mentioned, we're talking of ADSB, CPDLC, ground operations, not based on fossil fuels anymore, everything that can contribute to take the aircraft out of the ground quickly and getting it to the optimal flight level as well for the most of the flight. Then we have the pink portion, which is evolutionary aircraft using the new high bypass ratio engines that we have today. And maybe before the mid-century, a new generation of aircraft delivering 15 to 20% more efficiency over the current generation. Then we have a red strip. Actually, this is electric, battery electric and hybrid electric propulsion. As we can see, it's a small portion. This is mainly because of the battery weight. As most of us know, the batteries, they weigh 60 times more than Jet A. So beating the gravity on an electric aircraft is something that we are yet to see in a large scale with the current battery technologies and the current battery technologies forecast as well. Then the dark green is hydrogen. We think that hydrogen can contribute about 80 to 10% in the segment up to 150 packs, and I will cover that in one of the slides that I have here today. Then we have like 40 to 60%. We believe that 40 to 60% of sustainable aviation fuel may be available by 2050. And there is the gray portion, which is basically offsets or demand reduction. And in between offsets, demand reduction, and SAF, there is 10%, 15% area where we are not certain, and maybe it will vary from market to market. Okay, so now I'll talk about new products that can help to achieve this target. Next slide, please. So this is the Jet C2 aircraft carrying 100 to 146 packs. In this small portion of the narrow bodies, we call that the crossover section. Those aircraft, they can deliver a 25% less CO2, 30% less noise than its competitors, which make of them the quietest and greenest single-aisle aircraft in the market today. Next slide. Then by the end of this decade, we will introduce our new turboprop. We know that in the past, the turboprops had a huge number of market share. Then the jets replaced the turboprops. There are some aversion about turboprops because of noise, crowded cabins. But the thing is that with this turboprop, we are using the same cross-section of our E2 jets. And also we are positioning the engines in the rear fuselage that contributes a lot with noise and vibration. And more importantly, since we're talking about the environment, the turboprop in average can save up to 30% CO2 of the current fleet of aircraft it can replace. Next slide. So those are the more disruptive technologies. This is the Energia family aircraft from 90 to 50 packs. And why are they so small? If I can say so, it's because we think that the natural evolution of those new technologies, electric, hydrogen fuel cell, and hydrogen gas turbine, is it depends on starting those technologies on a smaller aircraft. Because then after they mature this technology, we can see by the mid-century those same technologies on larger aircraft. So here we have aircraft ranging from 200 to 500 nautical miles, delivering most of them, they deliver zero CO2 emissions. The hybrid deliver 50% CO2 reduction when compared to the similar aircraft of the same size. Next. So this is our complete portfolio. By 26, we will introduce our eVTOL Eve in the market. Then after that, the turboprop and the E2 will be 100% sustainable aviation fuel compatible from 2030 to 2040, those new Energia family concepts. And then by the mid-century, 2045 and 2050, we think the technology will be mature enough to have larger aircraft flying on hydrogen. Thank you. That was what I had for today. And I understand that we're going to have a Q&A.
Thanks very much.
Session, right?
Yep, I think we'll now move on to Nigel. Thanks a lot, Henrique, and we'll come back to you in the Q&A.
Thank you, Henrique. That was fascinating. Yes, so I'll first just introduce myself. Nigel Smith. I work at PA Consulting, director with a financial background and economic background. So I have previously been a chief financial officer of an airline in the UK, and also chief financial officer of UK Export Finance. So which UK Export Finance had a portfolio of over 1,000 aircraft under financing arrangements. And within PA, I do a lot of work relating to fleets and more recently on the sustainability side. So these slides are an extract from the presentation I gave at a carbon conference just over a month ago, to sort of give you a flavour of some of the sort of key issues that that I see in relation to carbon cost and how it's going to impact on strategy. Thank you. So first of all, just a bit about PA. We had an interesting starting point. The PA was actually founded to redesign manufacturing processes on the production lines during the Second World War, building military aircraft. So the entire history of the firm starts in aviation, and I'm obviously now the latest, one of the more recent members of the aviation team. Major shareholder Jacobs, the construction engineering company. We have over 4,000 staff. The aviation team has got over 80 people. A lot of airline and airports work all over the world, and we do both consulting and M&A projects. So that just gives you an idea of the range of what we do. Thanks. Next slide, please. So onto the sort of carbon material. So first of all, this material is actually available on the ATAG website. Anyone's interested, definitely worth going and having a look. ATAG's a cooperation between a number of industry leaders wanting to understand what the sustainability impact is for the industry. So their reports are widely used as a benchmark. Not necessarily 100% up to date, but incredibly useful starting point. Henrik was just talking about the sort of smaller end of the aircraft scale in terms of commuter, regional, and short haul. The ATAG chart here on the right also covers medium haul and long haul. And basically, as you see, if you go up the aircraft size and also the range, you find this increasing difficulty of coming up with new technology types, and that therefore SAF ends up being the principal solution. And if you look at I don't know whether you can all see on this webinar, the sort of the figures as the proportion of CO2 that's emitted. You can see long haul 30%, medium haul 43%, short haul 24%. So the bulk of emissions are actually at the upper end. So the sort of wide body long haul flights and the sort of people's holiday and business flights around Europe, the US, and other markets are actually what constitute the bulk of the emissions. And this creates an immense challenge for the industry. The chart on the lower right is a variant of what Henrik showed. He was looking specifically at the sub 150 market. This looks at all segments, and you can see the domination of SAF in terms of the sort of short, medium, long-term solution, and then some of the other market solutions, including operational improvements and fleet replacements. And it says SAF plus offsets, and certainly in the early years, the offsets are going to be absolutely critical part of this, because it's going to take a long time to build up the SAF production. Thank you. If we can jump on. So in terms of what's this all going to cost, Eurocontrol very kindly did an excellent report that comes up with some very large numbers in terms of cost impact. These are actually cumulative, so don't think this is the cost in any one year, but the cumulative cost of 2030 alone, they're estimating in Europe to be 62 billion euros to be borne by the airlines. And this is a combination of SAF-related costs, which are at obviously the early stage by 2030. There's then emissions trading schemes within Europe. So there's the EU scheme, there's the UK scheme because of Brexit, and also Switzerland has its own scheme. There are other ETS schemes elsewhere in the world. So, for example, there's various states of the United States that have ETS. So when you are operating in other regions, it is important to make sure you're complying with the local rules. The Chinese are even looking at adding aviation to their ETS scheme. So that's becoming quite prevalent. You can see from the table that's a huge cost. CORSIA, which many may have heard about, which is the international agreement created through ICAO, the United Nations body. The impact is tiny. In fact, it's a negative here because it offsets against the ETS, but the unit costs are much lower. The current EU ETS cost is about 60 to 70 euros a tonne. CORSIA is going to come in about 3 to 5 euros a tonne. So as a mechanism, it's relatively small. And then this final figure down, the extra taxation costs coming in at around 30 billion euros mark. There's new forms of the EU bringing in a jet fuel tax, and various other countries have brought in jet fuel taxes. The attitude of governments is that if the industry doesn't sort itself out, that they're going to tax demand down to reduce emissions that way. So there's a threat hanging over the industry. Thank you. Next slide, please. So where does this leave if airlines read operators? This presentation was an airline conference. This leaves a whole array of complexities facing aircraft operators in terms of what they've got to think about. And I've just put a number of them on here. So this is by no means all of them. So obviously got new jet fuel related regulations. At the time I wrote this presentation, there was a new regulation coming out almost every week. Climate change scenarios, very tricky one. Obviously, we're all aware of the fact that weather conditions are varying seemingly a lot more than they used to in the past. Competitiveness, so whether you're inside or outside the carbon regulated area, that can have a big impact. But also staff are often very aware of the fact that they are working for a polluting organisation and want to know that their company that they work for is doing something about this. So huge array of factors. I think you're getting the presentation afterwards, so I won't go through all of these. So if we could jump to the next slide. So I put some cost estimates together based on a combination of those Eurocontrol figures, but also Airbus for their 20-year forecast had actually made some estimates of what all the carbon costs are going to be in addition to jet fuel costs. And so I've applied them here, and I picked a typical European LCC, a long-haul airline, and then a hub airline. And the seat cost in euros for those three is 45 euros, 474 and 264. The fuel cost that relates to that, in the case of the LCC, a third of the cost is fuel. For the long-haul airline, it's just under a quarter, and for the hub airline, it's somewhat less than that. But the carbon costs, as they're now coming in, and these are actually quite conservative estimates. You can see here by 2030 alone, the LCC is going to have quite a big impact, and the long-haul airline. And by 2040, you're looking at the LCC having a 2/3 impact increase in their costs. Long-haul airline, 225 euros being added to the ticket price to cover carbon costs. What's the impact that going to be on long-haul leisure travel? You have to wonder, but also in business travel. So huge cost increases that the airlines are going to be facing. So what to do about that? And then next slide, please. So the area that we're focusing on is actually about understanding these costs and how they're going to develop both this decade and into the next decade, and how that's then going to need to cause the airline strategy to have to change. Got all those complexities I was talking about on the other slide, and then there's the whole series of factors that have got to be taken into account, including whether you've got cargo, stakeholders, including investors, are sort of putting some of the biggest pressure on. So access to capital is becoming increasingly challenging for those who choose not to try and reduce carbon. And obviously just the whole subject of SAF and the difficulties of getting hold of it, another absolutely critical area. And the key thing, anything in the aviation industry takes a long time. So the sooner airlines get their head around the cost and start changing the strategy, it's really got to start now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nigel. I think with that, we'll move to the Q&A session. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the questions. Yeah, and I have a few of my own questions to get started, especially. So in general, I think, Nigel, you talked about costs within the carbon-related costs because the EVDS, the compliance schemes, adding pressures for airlines to transition to net zero. How achievable do you feel this net zero goal is for aviation in general?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, as I said about, certainly in the case of the EU, if we don't do something about it, they'll just tax us out of the skies. So the industry's got to act, and that's so there is immense concern within the EU about the pace at which the industry can go. I mean, the biggest single problem, two problems right now. One is the manufacturers. I'll be interested to hear what Henrik has to say about this as well. They're seriously struggling to ramp up production rates, particularly shortage of engines. And so the fastest way of reducing carbon costs is actually to get next generation aircraft. But the manufacturers are really struggling at the moment to build them. And then the other one is just getting SAF plant built fast enough. Again, huge manufacturing headaches involved with that. But I think, you know, the industry will get there. 2050 is achievable, but I think it's going to be a bumpy ride on the way. And some of the targets that have got to be achieved, some of the targets in 2030 have been softened in the EU, but the 2035 targets are really tough.
Yeah, I agree. Enrique, over to you. What do you have any comments to add in?
Well, I actually agree with everything that Nigel said, particularly sustainable aviation fuels and fleet renewal are really important right now, but all the three major aircraft producers this year have had problems with supply chain, as he mentioned, engines particularly. And yeah, this is something that has been hard to ramp up.
Great. And just as a segue from that question into what other measures, Enrique, at Embraer are you considering, particularly within market-based measures?
Well, we think we are not against market-based measures. Of course, they are important. The first thing it's always try to develop new technologies, but again, it takes time. An aircraft, like it takes for us, we are the benchmark in the industry, but it still take 5 to 6 years to deliver an aircraft to the market. Also, we start developing it. A new technology aircraft will take longer than that, probably 7 to 8 years. So we are talking about 2030 already. So we think that the market dynamics is changing. People is relying a lot on digital platforms to communicate as we are today, is moving away from big cities. So the market dynamic is changing. We think that together with sustainability pressure will make the airlines focus even more on profitability. And because of that, market-based measures and particularly carbon offsets are important, because after all the technology makes its contribution, it is what we have at the end of the day, right?
And by when do you expect the problems in manufacturing to settle down for people to start accelerating their pace or getting back on track?
Well, we expect it to be back on track by next year, but something that I think everyone is well aware is that both Airbus and Boeing, they recently published that they will not develop any new aircraft in the upcoming decade. So I don't know. Let's see if that's really the case and how that can disrupt all the supply chain.
Yeah, that will be interesting. But Nigel, coming to you, what's your short-term outlook for new efficiencies in aircraft, maybe just within the next 3 to 5 years?
I mean, all of the manufacturers are sort of stepping up in terms of finding sort of the minor changes to the aircraft. Whereas in the past, sort of airlines would weigh up, is it worth buying, this extra, change that we can put on during the next major overhaul. Whereas now, I mean, really anything that enables carbon reduction, the airlines are going for. So I think the manufacturers are really stepping up on that front. And I mean, some of the sort of software changes that have been done on the aircraft in terms of how the aircraft flies, because the focus has sort of tended to be on time and other factors, whereas carbon emissions are obviously increasingly becoming the top priority. So there's actually quite a few changes. I was at a Boeing technical update just the other day, and they've got quite a number of changes coming through on their aircraft types that help the operators.
Yeah, I agree. That's all. I think with the next question, I'll try to bring in also Nick into the conversation. Nick, especially bringing in the business aviation operators perspective. What measures does Elitavia turn to improve fuel efficiencies within your fleet?
Well, we're sort of at the end of the chain, I guess you could say. I mean, we're at the mercy of the technology and the aircraft that we have. It really comes down to operational stuff in the sense of, like, for example, if you're operating in cold environments, try and put the aircraft in a hangar at night. So in the morning, when you're getting ready to get going, you're not running the APU or the engines for half an hour to warm up the aircraft. Same thing in warm weather environments. Don't leave the aircraft sitting on the ramp. Also, just general education of pilots about carbon emissions from aircraft. They do have a tendency to crank up the APU in the engines and leave them running. So it's really around educating the crew about what exactly the emissions are, because that's one thing I find in aviation. A lot of industry participants just really have no idea what the carbon emissions are from certain aircraft and engines. So there's a lot of education just telling people, because once you see the numbers, it's surprising. It's shocking almost. We're an operator. Our scope 1 emissions are huge. Compared to somebody who runs a consulting firm, they really don't have a lot of scope 1, but we do, because we burn fuel. 70% of our emissions as a company, we've measured Elite Avia, 70% are coming from essentially the fleet. For us, the other option is SAF, but the challenge we face with SAF is when we looked into using SAF, the majority of our fleet is sort of based in and around Europe. There are only 3 or 4 airports that you could actually get it. So I know there's a lot of discussion around SAF and expanding the availability, but at the moment, the availability is pretty small. And once we operate aircraft in Africa, once you get to the continent of Africa, there's really no SAF. And I think the other thing that people don't think about is sort of the chain of where aircraft end up. I mean, everybody's focused on the new aircraft and sort of the new technology, but the challenge we see is a lot of older aircraft out of the US, Europe, they end up somewhere else in some other market that maybe doesn't have the same kind of standards. So maybe that's something we should be thinking about, is where do those aircraft go at a certain point? Do they just get taken out of the fleet? So we're not sending them to another market where they just continue, producing emissions. So those are things that we sort of think about as an operator.
I think the last point I probably want to say again, which is a lot of the Eurocontrol report, for example, says this, that they will renew 1/3 of the European fleet. But again, it goes back to your point, Nick, which is the fleet in Europe gets renewed, but then there's also a secondhand market which is taking in those older aircraft and again burning fuel somewhere else. Another question for you, Nick, which is, so far, what have you seen as the acceptance level within clients for things like SAF or SAF-C credits or carbon offsets?
The clients sort of line up with the population in general. I mean, some of them are very focused on doing something. A lot of it is PR driven, in the sense of they are concerned that they're operating a business jet and there's potential negative PR around that. So therefore they're already offsetting. Most customers are generally interested in getting educated about it, but I would say at the moment, the majority are not doing anything. And then there are those that are, let's say, it's not a concern of theirs. So they run the gamut from those who are offsetting, even some who are double offsetting, all the way to those who don't see it as their issue. I think over time, the more that owners get educated, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of owners, they're the same as the general population. They have no idea in terms of the carbon emissions. If you go to markets outside of Europe, there's no requirement to measure. So it's not something that owners or even the operators are fully aware of in terms of just what the carbon emissions are. So I think there's a lot of education, and I think with the education, more people will take action to either reduce emissions or offset.
I agree. Thanks a lot, Nick. That's really helpful. Coming back into SAF for a few more questions, bringing in also Henrique and Nigel. A lot of the SAF supply has been mostly dominated, the future supply of SAF has been dominated by offtake agreements with commercial aviation. Do you see in the future a potential conflict for supply between commercial aviation and business aviation?
Sorry, do you want me to answer first?
Sorry, would you like me to repeat?
Yes, no, do you want me to answer first? Go first?
Yeah, Nigel, you can go ahead.
I mean, I think because the SAF supply is so limited, and also because we're looking at first generation SAF plant being built, where they're having to be underwritten by long-term offtake agreements from the airlines. It's going to make it incredibly difficult for others to actually get hold of SAF. So I think for a while there's going to be a huge issue around sourcing of it. But I mean, as SAF becomes more widely available as we go through the next decade, it should ease, but it's a long time until the next decade. So what does an operator do in the meantime?
Yeah, if I can add on that, when we stand as an operator, as a small operator as well, we fly our aircraft a few hours before delivering them to the customers, and we are in this crusade to get more sustainable aviation fuel as well. It's not easy. It's possible. The price, of course, it's higher than an airline that has an offtake agreement. This is a good point. It's a consensus in the industry. We need policies and incentives in place in order to really scale sustainable aviation fuel up. Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, I think the other point on SAF sort of within the EU is that because the EU's put the onus on the airports as well, and there's a threshold size of airport that's required to comply with the SAF uplift obligations. I suspect a lot of business aviation aircraft don't actually operate at the airports that are required. So again, with this rush to get SAF plant built and get offtake agreements in place, I think some of the smaller airports again are going to struggle.
Yeah, I think you made a good point, which is the Refuel EU initiative, which has the mandate for SAF supply at airports. Yeah, but I guess it's the question on the wider global availability of SAF, which will also become predominant later on.
There was one of the major airlines of the world, long-haul airlines of the world, at the conference, when asked where they were going to source their SAF from, and the audience was assuming that they were going to build the SAF plants in their own home country, simply said, well, we're going to buy it in Europe and America. So you've got an airline that's made a very high commitment to SAF uplift as a percentage of its fuel uplift, who's actually planning to buy outside their home market in the very same countries that have got the obligations. So it's going to be really challenging.
Yeah. I have one more question. I know we're coming to the end. This is mostly for Embraer. I wanted to bring in an interesting perspective that Henrique told me on one of the conversations that we had. Are there any changes to engine maintenance as a result of SAF consumption?
Okay, that's a good one. Well, actually, no. What the industry is pursuing, we call it the wig. The tail wigging the dog, not the dog wigging the tail. In Portuguese, there is this saying. And it's right. I mean, what industry is pursuing is to certify a 100% sustainable aviation fuel. And this is even more true for our blend that goes for 50%, which is compatible with all aircraft that we have today. Because if it's already a hurdle to get sustainable aviation fuel everywhere, can we imagine if it would require a different type of aircraft, a different type of maintenance procedure after using it? So what ESTM is leading and pursuing with the participation of all industry is to establish a standard which will be compatible with any aircraft existing today. We don't foresee any changes needed by now.
So can I just add to that?
Absolutely.
I mean, the engine manufacturers, I mean, there's a number of valves, you know, where the changes in the fuel and the heats and other factors mean that the valves have got to be replaced. Now that can happen during the next overhaul. So the valves are going through certification at the moment. So it's very much driven by when your next overhaul is. And if you've got an engine type that doesn't need an overhaul for a significant number of years, but these typically take you over the 50% mark. So you do over 50% SAF uplift. Like most aircraft types are okay up to 50%. And apparently the SAF fuel can actually burn cleaner. And once you've got the valves replaced, it means potentially your engine overhauls will extend out.
Yeah, that's great. And soot reduction in the engine, I think, just improves maintenance and maybe even engine life. But again, that might be speculation from my side. There's not much research, like Henrique was telling. There's not much research in this area. Yeah, there's a question from the audience, which you can just address before we close up, which is, it's a question for Henrique. Have you considered the use of the wheel tug system as a possibility to seriously reduce the fuel consumption?
The use of what? Sorry.
It's the wheel tug system. I'm not sure what that is.
Well, probably it's like a taxi device that connects to, I would suppose it's that, like electric taxi device. Well, our studies from this kind of device is that it of course it reduces the fuel consumption during taxi until the aircraft gets to the takeoff point, to the start of the runway. The thing is that most of the airports are so crowded that the route of the tug device after it leaves the aircraft is something yet to be figured. Maybe in some airports where there is like 2 taxiways or space to handle this kind of challenge, it will happen, and it can help for sure.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. Well, I think this brings us mostly to the end. Thanks a lot, Henrique and Nigel, and Nick, of course, for this interesting conversation. Thanks everyone for joining in. I think we will do another session most likely in a month, possibly in the new year, on SAF itself. So stay tuned for our newsletters. And if you need slides or need some more information or even an introduction with the panelists, reach out to us or directly to them. It's totally fine. And have a good evening and morning. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.